All right. So I started out. This is my first, just talking about the definitions. That my Midwest definition is broad. This is my Grassland definition. These are the maps that I was talking about earlier. So you've got transos. There's one from Wikipedia, the Illinois Natural History Survey, and so on. And so this one on the right-hand side here is kind of what I'm going with from the Society of Ecological Restoration. And then I showed this other map that the Southeastern Grassland Initiative put out, and then they include the longleaf pine savanna and some of the other grasslands and stuff. So just to give you an idea that, yeah, I have a fairly broad interpretation of our native grasslands. So then getting down to grasslands, plants and insects, what I was going through is, yeah, bugs have been around a long time, co-evolving with plants and so on. We've got a lot of different compounds that we use from insects. Many of them are, pretty closely associated with a few species of plants, and so their distributions are dictated by the distribution of their food sources. And so I think this is where we ran into trouble. So, all right. Current grassland distribution in the Midwest, as you may understand, there's been a massive reduction in our native grasslands over the last 100 years or so. I used this graphic from the state of Minnesota because they had a nice pretty map that shows their pre-settlement prairie and savannas, which is the yellow and the tan colors there. And then the dark red, that is the remnants that are still present today. And so you can see there was even in Minnesota, there was a massive reduction in native grasslands. The grasslands have been fragmented. You've got tiny, little scraps of these huge systems that are left. Many of them are on, fairly extreme topography, which is the primary reason why they weren't tilled or, overly grazed. So you get these things like these hill prairies here in southeast Minnesota, which are unglaciated, and to me had many similarities to the barrens in Kentucky and Tennessee and stuff. And so, yeah, a lot of our remnants are now either these scraps on hillsides or old railroad prairies like this one on the right, where the railroad's been ripped up and they've turned it into some sort of nature preserve. So there's been a great reduction. And so any organisms that occur in these systems and require nice rich native grasslands for their existence are likely going to be greatly reduced in distribution, given that their habitat is no longer around. And just in species richest alone, insects dominate these systems by orders of magnitude over all other organisms, pretty much. And this includes many colorful and charismatic species. So here we've got the cobweb skipper on the left. This is a little guy that occurs in xeric, dry grasslands, likes barrens a lot, glades. Old butterfly collectors like to say, we always get those on power line right-of-ways. And that's usually because that power line right-of-way goes right through a nice barrens area, and it kind of mimics the habitat that these guys like. They overwinter as a little caterpillar tucked into a grass clump. And so with those dry grasses all around them, they're pretty flammable during the dormant season, so they're considered pretty fire sensitive. Leafhoppers, there are many leafhoppers that occur in these grasslands. Many of them are very host specific, only feed on one or a few closely related species or genera of grasses. They overwinter as eggs laid in dried vegetation, and so again, they're very prone to being burned up in dormant season fires. Grasshoppers, another huge group that you might be aware of on grasslands. One of the cool ones that you guys have in Kentucky is the lichen grasshopper, which occurs on glades in the Appalachians. There's also populations in the Ozarks and the Shawnee Hills. So the adults look just like lichen. They hang on these lichen encrusted rocks. And there was a really cool little study from Tennessee recently that looked at these glade complexes that had all these little small, grasslands that were separated from one another by cedars and small oaks and stuff. And they found that these grasshoppers were not moving between those openings when they had dense vegetation in between. They didn't realize that there was more habitat on the other side. So that's one of the things with these guys, that they tend to be very isolated within a particular, grassland complex, and that, they often will see the dense vegetation as a barrier to dispersal. And then one other one that I'm going to talk about more later, is the rattlesnake master borer moth, which you guys have one of the few populations left in the world in Kentucky. It feeds on rattlesnake master, Rhingium yucifolium. And as I said, I'm going to talk about that guy a lot later, but it's a really pretty moth that the Fish and Wildlife Service just reviewed for listing as a federally endangered species. So insects and conservation. Many grassland insects are very habitat specific, as I said, not generally distributed on the landscape or even within a particular grassland remnant. You'll often find that their food plants aren't generally distributed within a particular remnant, and so these guys tend to be very patchy in their occurrence within a particular site. And given that their habitat has been reduced by more than 90%, many of these are similarly imperiled. Some examples here, this caterpillar on the left, Haydenic typa, feeds on starry campion, which is a kind of an open woodland savanna barrens plant. This guy used to be considered extremely rare and is still pretty rare. The adults are the primary pollinator for this plant. So they go around nectaring on these plants, they pick up pollen, they move from flower to flower, then they lay eggs in the flower, and their caterpillars feed on the developing seed pods. You'd think this might not be advantageous for the plant, but the plant just keeps putting out flowers and putting out new stems while they're being fed on, so they just keep producing more and more food. They seem to do really well with the insect. And this guy overwinters as a pupa underground, so he's protected from dormant season fires. People have started looking for these more now that I kind of got people fired up when I told them that I was finding these on starry campion around the Great Lakes, and so people have started looking for them more, and they're finding them. But he's a pretty cool bug. And the next one out is the swamp metalmark, which is this orange guy with the kind of blue lines through him. You have a few records for Kentucky. The larvae feed on thistles. They overwinter, partially grown around the little basal rosettes on the thistle plants. So they can be fire sensitive, but I think some of them are hiding underneath those leaves, and they're kind of protected from fire. If you get a relatively quick fire that moves through an area, they do well. This bug is doing awesome right across the river in southern Indiana, but your Kentucky populations are not doing well at all, and we're not really sure why. A few others, things like Hesperia atoi, the atoi skipper. He's a Great Plains guy, bunch grass feeder. Again, caterpillars overwinter, partially grown in clumps of grass, so they're considered fire sensitive. There's some disjunct populations in northwest Indiana and southwest Michigan, and these are not doing very well. So something seems to be affecting this bug, at least on the eastern edge of his distribution right now. This little tiny moth, this Neosymbopteryx, was described from a single specimen in Arkansas back in the early 70s. When I was doing insect surveys in central Kentucky, I snagged one of these guys in a sweep bed sample and had no idea what it was, and it sat around forever. I sent it off to somebody and they never got back to me, so never knew what it was until I caught a couple more after that at the same site. And then come to find out, this about a year ago, I think it was, somebody finally put a name on this thing for me. But other than the one specimen from Arkansas, the 3 or 4 from Kentucky, it's not known for any other individuals anywhere. And he's pretty distinctive, flies during the day, so we have no idea what this guy's ecology is. But I included him just to kind of show you some of the diversity. Its relatives feed on various Asteraceae. They wed the tips of the terminal leaves together. I'm sorry. So the guy in the lower left-hand corner you might know, the Carner blue butterfly. He's kind of famous, occurs in oak barrens up in the Midwest, around the Great Lakes. Used to be in the Northeast, been massively, just went extinct in 2012. So their larvae feed on lupin. They overwinter above ground, so they're fairly fire sensitive. And he's really reduced. There's some good-sized populations left in Michigan and Wisconsin, and like one left in New York, and that's about it. So not doing well. The Powashiek skipper, or is my Powashiek here? I'll talk about him a little bit later. He's a cute little Great Plains guy that really underwent a massive population decline in the past few years and was recently listed as a federally endangered species. 2 grasshoppers are grass feeders that occur both with the one on the far right there, the Pseudopomla, feeds on a little blue stem, and then Irritetics. He likes a bunch of different grasses, likes Cytodes grama a lot, Bouteloua. But again, he's real common in the Great Plains, but you get these weird little isolated populations on glades in the Appalachians, and then also in some of the barrens in central Kentucky. He's a pretty cool bug. Overwinters above ground, so a little bit fire sensitive. And then both of those grasshoppers actually occur above ground during the wintertime. And so basically what I've just been telling you, rent-dependent insects are typically highly specialized, cannot survive without their host plants, and often many of them seem to have other factors in addition to the distribution of their host plant that is limiting their particular distribution, either humidity, aspect, soil type, things like that. So there appears to be and for many species, it appears to be a complex of issues that are limiting their distribution. A subset of these grassland remnant-dependent insects have greatly reduced dispersal capabilities, which in most cases means they don't have wings for flying. This is especially true like in female leafhoppers. They tend to be very heavy-bodied. They don't really have hind wings. They can't fly. They can jump around and crawl around on plants, but that's about it. So given that they can't cover large areas in short periods of time, it limits their ability to move between food plant patches and also between habitat patches or to colonize newly restored habitat. As I've told you, many of these bugs also hibernate above ground, which makes them susceptible to death during dormant season fires. And I just gave some examples here. That caterpillar on the left, that's one of the caterpillars I was telling you. This guy here is a leafhopper laying eggs in a stem, hibernating bumblebee, some ladybugs, and then just a little bit of fire. So on to grassland insects in Kentucky. So as I said, many insects use native grasslands for food and shelter, but not all these guys are, limited to them. Some insects, they're just looking for structure, particular height of vegetation, density of, nectar sources, soil for nesting and things like that. So they can occur in a variety of different habitats. They may prefer prairies or grasslands, but they're not necessarily restricted to them. But of the groups that are restricted to our native grasslands, there's 3 good-sized orders that contain a large number of species that have been pretty well researched and that we have at least some information on, that we can try to make some decisions, conclusions regarding their remnant dependence and how conservation, how much we should be focusing on them regarding conservation. So the 3 groups are the Homoptera, which includes a lot of the little soft-bodied bugs like leafhoppers, plant hoppers, aphids. The Lepidoptera, which are the butterflies, skippers, and moths, and then the Orthoptera, which is the grasshoppers, crickets, katydids. That used to include things like praying manids and walking sticks and stuff, but those have been sorted out into other orders now. And so, as I've mentioned many times now, given the near total elimination of our native grasslands, these groups also contain many species that are of conservation concern. So I started doing work in Kentucky, well, seriously anyway, like in the 90s. My parents lived in Lexington for a while in the 80s, and I went traveling around with members of the Kentucky Lepidoptera Society, collecting bugs here and there around the state. But it wasn't until 1990 I contacted the Nature Conservancy in Kentucky, got talking with Barry Dalton, who was the stewardship director at the time, and he was really interested in grasslands and he was interested in insects. And so we got talking, and we put in for a little grant through the Nature Conservancy to do surveys on about 6 sites, I think, in central and western Kentucky. And so that kind of really got me excited, because I had just kind of been picking up, in the 80s, this whole insect conservation thing was kind of coming together. And so I was just starting to think about these things when I was down there in Kentucky. And so we were both interested in looking to see, what occurred on these grasslands and if any of these species might be of conservation concern, and how, habitat restoration and management activities could potentially either benefit or possibly, harm these particular insects. So how to go about catching bugs. I used 3 primary techniques for collecting insects when I was in Kentucky. Basically, the typical visual surveys, walking around the butterfly net and catching whatever you see flying. We use that for butterflies, skippers, other day flying insects. Sweep nets, which are just basically an aerial net with heavier material so that the vegetation doesn't chew it all up. You use that for sweeping through vegetation to get insects that are actually living right on the plants. And then I used ultraviolet lights, either light sheet or these bucket traps for sampling nocturnal insects like moths, Some leafhoppers like to come to light, and then there's some katydids, grasshoppers that'll show up at light at night sometimes. So those are my three primary techniques, mostly just walking around looking for bugs and then trying to catch them. And so what were our results? So I have identified over 1,000 insects. I think in my sites in southern Indiana, I'm up to, I think, almost 1,400 species of insects now. So I figured this was a reasonable number to talk about. So yeah, more than 1,000 insects from Kentucky. This includes new state records, some crazy major new range extensions. I had no idea these things occurred in Kentucky. So it was really interesting to see them show up. In terms of numbers of species, Lepidoptera dominated, especially the moths. You know, there's just so many species in that group. They dwarf the others. But the Homoptera and the Orthoptera were interesting in that they hadn't really been looked at in Kentucky before. So we found all sorts of neat new stuff for the state of Kentucky. And, you know, looking at the total fauna and doing research in literature and talking to other people, it looks, you know, conservatively 30 to 35% of our total butterfly, moth, grasshopper, leafhopper, planthopper fauna in Kentucky, well, in the Midwest, is considered moderately to strongly remnant dependent, meaning that they like native grasslands. You know, they'll occur in some chewed up sites, but it's almost predominantly they're found in really nice grassland remnants. And of course, as I said before, this includes many species that should or could be considered state rare, threatened, or endangered in Kentucky. And some of these have been listed, some of them have not. More than 100 species. I'll go through the three groups now and just talk a little bit about each of them. For the Homoptera, more than 180 species of leafhoppers and planthoppers have been recorded from the region to date. There's probably twice that many. I've been focusing on a very small number of remnants, and then you know, I haven't looked at other habitats as well in the area. So there's probably lots of leafhoppers and planthoppers remaining to be identified from the region. Many of these leafhoppers and planthoppers, as I've mentioned before, feed exclusively on native grasses. Others are forb feeders. Forbs, I'm just herbaceous broadleaf plants. I'm just referring to them as forbs. Especially members of the family Asteraceae, big family, as you might expect. You get quite a few bugs that like to feed on them. Many Homoptera overwinter as eggs inside of dried vegetation. The females have a little skinny ovipositor like a knife. They stick it in between the plant tissues and lay their eggs. And given that these are, you know, nice dried clumps of vegetation during the dormant season, it makes these guys pretty fire sensitive while they're still in that condition. So they're a very interesting group to look at fire effects and how populations respond after prescribed burns. And so there were quite a few notable leafhoppers that I'll show you some pictures of in a minute, a bunch of scientific names that nobody will remember. This little guy at the end, this Fitch Yellow Robertsoni, was just an amazing find. That bug was known from, I think, 3 or 4 populations prior to when I started working in southern Indiana, and found some really nice populations. So he's a cool bug. I'll show you in a minute. The first group I was going to talk about is this genus Chlorotetics, the big green leafhoppers. I mean, by big, I mean, you know, 7, 8, 9 millimeters long, which for leafhoppers is pretty big. It's a big group, 60 plus described species. In the last revision, I think it was in the 30s or 40s. So the group needs some work. A lot of them appear to be restricted in distribution to native habitats, especially open woodland, savanna, barrens. There's a fair number of them that also occur in wetlands and wet wooded areas that have lots of sedges. I gave you pictures of some fairly distinctive looking chlorotetics, but most of them look like this Chlorotetics spatulatus or limosus. They vary in the degree of pointiness to their head. And then you also, for most of them, you have to look at the genitalia to tell them apart. You can look at the external genitalia, and then others you have to do dissections and look at the stuff inside, which is probably the reason my vision is not what it used to be. So the next group that I want to talk about is the genus Flexamia. This group of leafhoppers is one of the most well-studied group of leafhoppers around, especially for a group that doesn't include agricultural pests. So it's been kind of cool that there's been so much research on these guys, and there's none of them that are real pest species anyway. 45 described species at least. I got to describe a new one from Michigan years ago. It's as I said, a very well-studied group. All species feed almost exclusively on native grasses. There's some that are on some sedges and rushes. Almost all of them are found only in high quality natural areas, and as you might imagine, includes several species of conservation concern. This Fleximia picked on the left is a 3-on grass, Aristidus specialist, only found in really dry, especially sandy areas where you get a lot of 3-on grasses. Fleximia areolata, oops, is an Eragrostis spectabilis, purple lovegrass specialist. He'll feed on some other things, but that's one of its favorites. Dry, xeric, barrens, and grasslands, glades. Fleximia reflexa, very uncommon leafhopper, but appears to be doing really well in Kentucky grasslands. Indian grass specialist, also seems to feed on big blue as well, but really likes Indian grass. It is a really nice bug. And then this Fleximia albida up here on the right has not been found in Kentucky, but it's in nearby states. It specializes on Cytotes grama, Budula curtipendula, and I know you guys have some glades that have that grass on it, so it has potential, but it would be a long shot. It'd be interesting to see. A lot of these guys look like Fleximia reflexa or this Fleximia whitcombii down here. So you usually have to do dissections to look at the internal genitalia, especially the males. They have highly specialized ADA with all sorts of projections and horns and whatnot that are species specific, and so you can identify them by looking at their naughty parts. Another group is the Paraflepsius, genus Paraflepsius. Again, huge group, pretty good sized leafhoppers. Most of them are in that 6 to 8-9 millimeter range, so big for a leafhopper. At least 60 described species. Fairly well studied group. There was a revision in the 70s. Again, tends to be a savanna and barrens group, and some really cool species. Found some odd new things in southern Indiana, and you guys have got some really cool stuff from Kentucky. So it's a very interesting group. A lot of them appear to feed on various Asteraceae, although there's a few that feed on things like pine trees and a couple of shrubs, but a lot of them appears to be various Asteraceae. This group I like a lot. These guys are super tiny. The genus Polyamia, they all run about 2-3 millimeters in length. They feed on these Dicanthelium bunch grasses, little panic grasses, primarily flightless, don't have any hind wings, so they just hop around, crawl around, and make some pretty dispersers. Some really rare species. This Polyamia albinura and that Polyamia brevipennis, those guys are known from, I don't know, less than 20 populations in the world, and several of those are probably non-existent anymore. So really pretty cool group. You have an amazing diversity in Kentucky. Mantle Rock out in western Kentucky, there in Livingston County, you had every one of these species. It's a fantastic diversity of Polyamia on that particular preserve. So really cool group. And then I just threw in some other home ops to give you an idea of the rest of the diversity. Prairiana canzana, you have that from one site in central Kentucky. That's a cool grassland bug that we still don't know a heck of a lot about that. The genus Scaphidaeus, another huge genus. It's in bad need of revision. At least 60 species. Very colorful. Appears to be a lot of Asteraceae feeders. Others are on shrubs and trees, but very colorful, really pretty group. Various plant hoppers, feed on grasses. Again, you can see these guys have tiny little wings, so none of these fly. So they tend to be very local in distribution. Samia striminia down here on the lower left is a Helianthus mollis, downy sunflower feeder. One population in Kentucky. We've got like one site in southern Indiana, primarily a Great Plains species. So really interesting that thing showed up in Kentucky. The genus Texananus, they're pretty big leafhoppers, get up 12-13 millimeters. Kind of a mottled brown group. Savanna, barrens, grasslands, really just a neat group that you have quite a few species in Kentucky. Right, that's that Ficciella robertsoni that I was talking about. He's wingless, got that big crazy looking nose on him. Was initially known from, I don't know, just a couple of sites, and I found it on a few sites in southern Indiana. I think we're up to, it's less than 10 populations, I think, for this thing now that are known. So just an incredibly rare bug. And then the second group is the Orthoptera, grasshoppers and their relatives. Over 27,000 species worldwide. We got roughly 10% of those in the U.S. here. I think I've recorded around 50 from Kentucky grasslands. Well-studied group, given you've got quite a few agricultural pests in there. Except for some katydids and related manads, nearly all are herbivorous. Although a lot of grasshoppers do like to chew on dead cadavers of other grasshoppers, and they actually use that as a biocontrol method. They infect these cadavers with this bacteria that kills grasshoppers, and they spread those all over the rangeland out west to annihilate grasshoppers every year. Hespertenyx viridis, this little guy on the lower left, extremely colorful, really pretty. Our eastern subspecies, Pratensis, is probably a distinct species. Regular Hespertenyx viridis occurs out in the Great Plains, looks very different from ours. The eastern populations tend to be highly isolated on really nice little native grasslands, either glades along the Appalachians or barrens in central Kentucky. This Trimertropus saxatilis, that is the lichen grasshopper that I mentioned to you earlier. I found him out at Mantle Rock. He's on the sandstone barrens there, and then he's also on the sandstone and granite barrens up in the Appalachians. So cool bug, very few records from Kentucky, very rare. And then this one on the right, Myrmeria bifetata, that's a big bug. They get, I don't know, 3 inches long or so. Was really surprised to find that in Kentucky. That's a Great Plains guy. I think there's a couple records in the Southeast Atlantic Coastal Plain. You've got that from like 2 sites in central Kentucky. Is pretty rare. Appears to be a big blue stem feeder. So very pretty bug. And then on to the butterflies. This is the group that most everybody is familiar with. Over 20,000 species of butterflies in the world, about 3,500 species of skippers. And then you got about 515 butterfly species in North America and about 300 skipper species. So around 800 species of butterflies and skippers. Approximately 150 species of butterflies and skippers have been recorded from Kentucky to date. This is one of the most well-studied group of insects. People like them. They're pretty. They catch people's attention, so there's been quite a bit of work on them. And this group includes many fire-sensitive species of known conservation concern, and that's primarily because there's just been so much research done on them. And these guys all occur in Kentucky, or at least did until recently. The Cerinus martialis, that's the purplish dusky wing. Their caterpillars feed on New Jersey tea, Ceanothus, overwinter in little nests made in dried leaves at the base of the plant. So they're pretty fire sensitive. Real good population in southern Indiana and certain sites in central Kentucky. This next guy here, Calyphlus muticum, that's the swamp metalmark butterfly that I mentioned earlier. Larvae feed on thistles. It was originally described from prairie fens in southern Michigan, and then people started collecting specimens from the barrens in the Ozarks in southern Missouri, and come to find out there's quite a few populations on barrens scattered through Missouri. I don't know if they're in southern Illinois, but you've got them in central Kentucky and then southern Indiana. The central Kentucky populations are not doing well. Not sure why. The one site where they used to have a pretty good population, it's just been getting hit with development. So people are putting up houses and destroying habitat. So it's just slowly starting to disappear. But so far as we know, we have large populations in southern Indiana. Caterpillars are thistle feeders, primarily tall thistle. Cirsium altissimum will also feed on Cirsium discolor. And then the ones in the fens up in Michigan feed on swamp thistle, which is Cirsium muticum. But he's a real pretty bug. 2 populations out in early June, and then again late August, early September. This guy, Spirea Aphrodite fritillary. Caterpillars feed on violets, overwinter partially grown in the leaf litter. So again, fire sensitive. This thing occurs in scattered populations along the glades and openings in the Appalachians, and then a few barren sites in central Kentucky, I think, and then I've seen it once or twice in southern Indiana. So in our region, this guy's pretty uncommon. You get a little bit further north and west, he gets a little more common, but around here is pretty local. Lower left, that's the Leonard skipper. Widespread across a variety of different grassland types, especially barrens. Really likes barrens a lot. Comes out late in the season, late August, early September, when things like Liatris aspera is blooming. That's one of its favorite nectar sources. The caterpillars feed on grasses, like some of the other ones I mentioned before, the overwinter partially grown, and so they're considered fire sensitive. This guy in the middle on the bottom, marbling, is a native mustard feeder in barrens. So things like Erebus levigata, the caterpillars feed on that. The adults nectar at flowers and stuff. Mostly in these little glades and barrens in the eastern part of the state. And this guy's very uncommon in Kentucky. I don't think there's been many collections of that in the last, say, 20 years or so. And then it's got the lower right is the frosted elfin butterfly, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit here in a little bit. And so I just want to throw a photo of that in for you. And on to moths. Again, the largest group of grassland insects. Pretty much any site that you're on, especially barrens, your number one group of insects in terms of diversity numbers is probably going to be the moths. 160,000 species worldwide, with 11,000 in North America at least. More than 2,240 species of moths have been recorded from Kentucky to date. So you guys have a fantastic diversity. One of the largest groups of insects, but the biology of some of them is not that well studied. But despite that, there are quite a few groups that have been worked on, and we do have information on them, and that we know that they are of conservation concern, including many fire-sensitive species. So I'll run through these guys fairly quickly. This Acronicta alborufa, I took him in central Kentucky back in the 90s. Haven't seen him there since. Used to be common, or relatively common, across the eastern U.S. up until the 70s, and then just disappeared. Now they take them in the Ozarks of Missouri. This site in Kentucky, we assume, still has them. There might be a few others, but that's it. It's just appeared from 80. It's a distribution. Catocala dulceola has always been pretty rare. He's a hawthorn feeder, Crataegus. Likes open barrens, old pastures and stuff that have a lot of Crataegus, but just not a common bug. They overwinter as eggs on bark on the branches, so they're probably fire insensitive unless the tree actually got killed and they wouldn't have any food to feed on when they hatch in the spring. So the genus Shinia here, I've got 3 with their caterpillars, and I got this other guy, Sanguinea. These are they call them the flower moths commonly, and their larvae feed on developing fruit and flowers of their food plants. So they tend to be very host specific, one or a few closely related species of plants. The Shinia sanguinea, their larvae really like Liatris spicata. So late in the summer, you can find the caterpillars on that. The moths are out midsummer. Shinia nandina, goldenrod, especially like old field goldenrod, showy goldenrod, likes real dry, barrensy sorts of habitats. Shinia jaguarina was a Great Plains species that there used to be these real isolated records from a few spots in the southeast. And come to find out, somebody was out on a site in southern Ohio, and they started finding these crazy looking yellow caterpillars with these big black spots on them. Somebody reared them out, and they got this moth that looks just like Shinia jaguarina, but the caterpillars don't look anything like Shinia jaguarina. Shinia jaguarina's caterpillar is green with these real narrow longitudinal yellowish white stripes, and then it has these real tiny black spots. It doesn't look anything like this caterpillar, yet the adults are very similar. This is about to be described as a new species, hopefully within the next year or so, but appears to be quite rare and local. The caterpillars feed on Cerealia, which is now, I think, or Bexlum is one of the genera. Scurfy peas, they feed on the fruit, developing fruit and flowers of that, and you can find them sitting out on the vegetation. So it's a pretty cool bug, and kind of neat that we've got these new species being described from an area that's been pretty heavily collected by butterfly and moth collectors for quite a while, but yeah, we're still turning up new things, so it's kind of neat. Shinia gare, as you might wonder, feeds on Gara as a caterpillar. Again, flowers, developing seed heads. It's got this crazy stripy looking caterpillar that you would think kind of would stand out on its food plant, but when you see, they actually blend in pretty well. The butterflies have that beautiful pinkish yellow color because they rest on the flowers during the daytime, and they're pretty well camouflaged. Back to Paphiopema oryngii. I'm going to talk about him again. I just throw in as many pictures of him as I could for you. So when I found him in Kentucky, that about blew my mind. So they have these crazy looking caterpillars, kind of striped like a candy cane. And when they get older, those colors kind of fade. They turn a dingy white, but it's a neat group. Oryngii feeds on Oryngium yucifolium, rattlesnake master. Paphiopema beeriana feeds on Liatris, bores into the lower stems and the rootstock of Liatris. Paphiopema moths overwinter as eggs laid on either the ground or dead vegetation. Ringia, I'm pretty sure it's on dead vegetation. So these guys are considered pretty fire sensitive. Fires tend to knock their numbers way down. Some of them can even be eliminated from sites by certain fires. So they're very fire sensitive, which may seem odd given that they, evolved with grasslands for so long. But I think part of that is probably timing and the fact that, everything's just been reduced to such small patches. You don't have the continuity or the contiguous grasslands you had before, so that, things could move in from unburned refugia into these recently burned habitats. And I'll talk about that more in a little bit. Another cool bug, Meroplion ambifusca. Originally described from Michigan. Really cool moth collector from back in the day. Yeah, he took him in his back porch. The original series came right from his back porch. He had fens, and we think, well, I've taken it elsewhere in fens in Michigan. But when you get down to like Kentucky, Missouri, and some other southern Indiana, it occurs in barrens. And it appears to be closely associated with Indian grass. But this summer, I was doing a survey of some old growth remnants in east central Indiana, no prairie or anything, but they had streams that went through them and had wetland vegetation along it. That guy showed up at one of my lights. And I mean, this is a remnant surrounded by corn and beans, so I don't think it came from that. So they must occur in slightly more habitats than we initially thought they did. I was really rather surprised to run into that guy in close canopy forest. Grammy figurata, tiger moth. Their larvae, I tend to call them salad feeders. They feed on a variety of broadleaf plants in barrens, and similar sorts of grasslands. Figurata is a neat bug, tends to be fairly uncommon. It seems to be pretty strongly remnant dependent. And then this guy down here in the lower right, Trisynympha formosa, is primarily a boreal species, but it comes down the Appalachians into eastern Kentucky, and I think you might even have a couple of other scattered populations, maybe like around the Red River Gorge area or such. The larvae of those guys feed on blueberry, and then they overwinter as pupa underground, so probably not that terribly fire sensitive. So, in summary, there are a lot of bugs, over 1 million species worldwide. Some people think there's at least 5 times that many. Grasslands hold a huge, yet often poorly sampled, diversity of insects. There's been more research recently, but still there's many, many grassland remnants out there that have not been touched, especially like in the southeast, like the old, pine savanna remnants and things like that. So people are starting to hit them, but it's still an ongoing process. So as I mentioned, some of these insects are picky about what they eat and where they live. Fair percentage of these picky eaters, 30-35% of our regional fauna, are found only or primarily on high quality native grassland remnants. And many of these insects spend their winters above ground, making them fire sensitive. And then a subset of these fire sensitive species are fairly lethargic, let's say. They just don't move around that much. And so it takes them quite a bit of time, if at all, to move into these newly restored areas if the unburned refugia are, of a distance that is beyond what they're, used to moving. Because of the current patchy nature of the required habitats, these factors greatly limit their ability to escape fire and find new habitat, as I've mentioned. And they also make them of conservation concern. Oops, sorry. And in addition, insects provide a lot of ecological services. Now, putting dollar amounts on this was fun, so I tried to do what I could looking around on the internets. They figured at least $84 billion in annual ecological services, and then I just threw a table in here to kind of break that down. Dung beetles burying dung, pest control, all the biocontrol agents that we both use, them, the ones that just naturally occur and keep pest insects in check. You got pollination services, wildlife nutrition, human nutrition, which is growing by just amazing leaps and bounds. Much of that is actually that 7.8 billion is the global honey trade. That's huge. And then I kind of separated out some other non-food related insect sorts of things that we use, like beeswax, silks, dyes, lac for lacquer, comes from little scale insects. and that's around 4 billion US dollars. So in the US alone, yeah, we've got close to $85 billion in services being provided by insects every year. So they're pretty handy little organisms. And so I thought I would run through some case studies to give you a little bit more detail on some of these species and show you some of the varied threats that they have. The first one that I wanted to talk about was the regal fritillary. Back in the late 1800s, even into the early 1900s, that thing was widely distributed across the northeastern half of the U.S., especially, as you can see, down along New England and down into the Appalachians. There were quite a few populations. Ohio had lots of populations, apparently. But beginning in the 1970s, this guy just disappeared from Michigan, disappeared from Ohio. We're down to the point now where in that area that I have circled, including Maine, there's 2 populations left, one in western Pennsylvania and one of questionable viability left in Virginia. So this bug is really, really a massive population decline. So it appears to require a large, diverse landscape, native grasslands, pastures, farms, wetlands, and so on and so forth. They can survive in somewhat degraded habitats. One of the big populations in Illinois and the ones in Indiana, they're on these chewed up sand prairies, but they're still holding on because there's violets for them to feed on. They overwinter as a partially grown caterpillar in the leaf litter, so they're considered fire sensitive. And so what has happened? Now, there was a review of the western populations back in 2007, looking at the kind of the central Great Plains area, and they said that they thought they were still holding on pretty good. But if you look at this map from NatureServe, the blue is all bad. That's extirpated. Red, very rare, 1 or 2 populations, and then orange, a few more populations, and yellow, they're supposedly hanging on pretty well. But if you look in this review they did in 2007, looking at South Dakota and Nebraska, there's compared to what there used to be in the number of the blue on this map here is all historic records, and then the red is more recent records. And so you can see they were widely distributed, appear to have really undergone some sort of population decline in Nebraska, although that might be an artifact of sampling. These red dots here in the central part, I put those in because I saw regal fritillaries out there a couple of years ago when we were driving through. The Sand Hills and the Loess Hills of Nebraska here in central Nebraska is some of the largest tracts of undisturbed grassland left in the U.S. It's just amazing pasture grassland out there. Some really neat sites. Most of it, so there's not a lot of public lands out there, but the landowners know that these areas are highly erodible, so they really take pride in their grasslands and tend to not chew them up. So it's a neat area. So I got a feeling that they just didn't do the surveys out there because it's kind of a remote area. So anyway, I wanted to talk about this in a little more detail. So this was 2007 when they did this review. Now, in the mid 2000s, the US EPA put out a mandate for ethanol that our gas that we use in our cars needed to have at least 10% ethanol. Well, that led to massive planting of corn all over the Great Plains and speculation on the price of corn. So corn that was $4, $4.25 a bushel shot up to $8, $10, $12 a bushel, and so people were just clearing land like crazy. They were taking land out of CRP and tilling that up. Native prairies got tilled. It was just a disaster. And so if you look, if you look at this map here that they show, where those states outlined in red are where they did their review before, that's where this bug was supposedly hanging on. Well, if you look at this map here of the loss of prairie habitat, you can see that where you had these, fairly large concentrations of regal fritillaries, that's the area where it was losing the most grassland. So it's just, you had up to 30% change in the amount of prairie in a 5-year period. That's just insane. And there was this cute little butterfly, the Poweshiek skipperling, that we had always been told. I did work on this in Southeast Michigan years ago, and we had always been told, oh, there's these fantastic populations out in the Great Plains that are just incredible. Well, they went and did surveys there in the oh, I don't know, it was around 2012, 2013, I think. These populations in the Great Plains are all gone. They're just gone. Part of it was habitat conversion. Part of it was probably fire, overgrazing, and then just some things we're not even sure, because the populations here in Michigan are also undergoing massive declines. A site that I used to work on where I would see hundreds of these things flying during the day. They're lucky if they see 2 or 3 individuals now. And this is in 20 years. So it's pretty sad what's happened. And you got to figure that that's not just happening to that bug. There's other organisms that are facing that sort of decline as well. So this thing may disappear in my lifetime, which would be really rather a shame. It's a pretty cool little bug, but yep, just not doing well. And so, yeah, we had loss of land formerly protected through CRP. We thought that would protect these grasslands. They tend to be on marginal habitats, either light soils or, extreme slopes or too wet or something like that. And so, but they got converted to corn anyway because the price was just too much. Luckily, there were efforts taken after this to try to minimize that conversion, but a lot of the damage had already been done. And so it was converted to corn for ethanol production. You also had increased pesticide load going on. You've got, Roundup Ready corn and beans now. You got people spraying, pesticides to get rid of, corn pests and things. They think pesticides may be one of the threats here in Michigan right now on some of those sites that are surrounded by agricultural land. So it has not been good. And so, yeah, with all this continued loss of these grasslands, you lose habitat connectivity. So these species just can't move back and forth between these sites. Another one that occurs, well, at least recently occurred in Kentucky, is the frosted elephant butterfly. So again, used to be widely distributed Midwest, Southeast, Northeast. Again, 70s, started disappearing, now absent from much of its range, being considered for federal protection. Require a diverse landscape of these different grassland types, and requires large populations of the larval food plant, which in Kentucky is shrubby wild indigo, Baptisia tinctoria, which is a very rare plant in Kentucky. And this butterfly is crazy. They come out really early in the spring. So for you guys, it would have been probably early May, because this guy was down in the mountains in the southeast part of the state. They come out, the adults mate, lay eggs, the caterpillars feed on the Baptisia, and then they're a pupa by like early mid-June. So that thing's sitting as a pupa on the ground from mid-June until the following May. So any fire that might occur in that intervening time period should be considered probably fairly detrimental to any pupa that would be on the ground at that time. Now, they've done some research that a certain percentage of these caterpillars, maybe 25% of them, will actually burrow into the soil to pupate down to, I don't know, I think 3 centimeters. I think it was the deepest. They went a little over an inch. But they've done studies that often in the fires that they looked at going through these habitats, you were getting lethal temperatures going down, to 3/4 of an inch in some cases. So these larvae, probably not all the ones that go subterranean get saved. It's probably just a small fraction of those that would actually survive a fire. Then people have noted that on areas that have been completely burned, you can come out the next year sometimes and see 1 or 2, frosted elephants flying around. So it can seem to survive fire in certain situations. So here's some maps. This first one's from the Fish and Wildlife Review. You can see there were a lot of populations, all those white dots. But again, all those white dots are of unknown condition right now. And the vast majority of those should probably be considered extirpated. Tennessee, they had western one, Alabama, many of those in North Carolina, Virginia, along the Atlantic coast there, those are all gone. So, and you can see, looking at the map from NatureServe, orange and red, bad, blue, also bad, that's extirpated. And so we're just unsure as to what's going on with a lot of these. People are out doing surveys, but again, they haven't completed that just yet. So what limits this guy's distribution? Well, there are inherent factors. They have fairly narrow habitat requirements. They have fairly low dispersal capabilities. These butterflies aren't that strong of flyers. They're small. They don't move around a lot. And they tend to occur in small populations. So they are small and isolated populations that are, relatively prone to being, extirpated by various factors that might affect them. And then, in the past, we had connectivity between these little patches to some degree, and so you would get species, individuals moving in to these areas from these other spots to recolonize them. So habitat loss, degradation, that's a huge problem, as you would imagine. Insecticides, herbicides, invasive plants, disease to some degree maybe, and then competition with the herbivores. Problem we have in the Great Lakes, where this butterfly feeds on lupin along with the Karner blue butterfly, is deer love lupin, especially the flower heads, which would have developing larvae of this guy and the Karner blue on it. So deer come in to eat those heads. They're probably eating lots of the immatures of these guys and then eliminating them from the population. So you get all sorts of odd competition going on, and then obviously, just direct predation and parasitism from other insects, spiders, so on. Well, the last case study I wanted to do was Papipema oryngii, the rattlesnake master borer moth. Its distribution prior to European colonization of the Americas is unknown. We really don't know, but it apparently occurred throughout the Midwest, Eastern Great Plains, and the Southeast. It was originally described from Chicago in the early 1900s, thought to have gone extinct after the 1930s. No specimens were seen until 1989, when it was rediscovered by a guy by the name of Ron Panzer on a prairie remnant in South Chicago. In 1991, I came to Kentucky and was visiting a site that I had been shown by Barry Dalton from the Nature Conservancy in central Kentucky. And my wife and I went out there one Saturday just to walk around. And I happened to see a bunch of eryngium growing there. And I'm like, hey, I wonder if that moth could be here. First plant I looked at looked just like the larva bore down into the basal rosetta leaves and then go into the rootstock, and that tends to kill those innermost leaves in the rosette, and they don't put out a flower stalk. So sure enough, first plant I walked over and looked at, there's frath, caterpillar poop all over the place. I ended up digging up 4 of them, taking them. We moved to Montana not long after that, reared them out, and sure enough, it was Papipema oryngii. So that was amazing. People freaked out. Everybody thought that moth was an endemic in the Chicago Lake Plain area. So to find that in Kentucky was just amazing. People didn't believe me at first. I had to send the specimens off to an expert to get him to actually go, yep, that's what it was. So again, we think this bug required a diverse landscape of barrens and savanna, glades, open woodland with abundant rattlesnake master. That plant gets removed pretty rapidly by grazing, and deer like it. Cows will preferentially feed on eryngium, so they can rapidly, and it doesn't do well when grazed on. So that plant can be removed pretty rapidly from a site. So that's probably what happened to a lot of these populations. As I said before, this whole genus of moths overwinters as eggs, either laid on dried vegetation or on the soil surface nearby, and so they're considered very fire sensitive. And then I'll show you some other stuff. So this map here on top shows the current distribution. This is from the recent review by Fish and Wildlife. Green are considered fairly resilient populations. They're large. They cover a good size area. They could probably put up with a fair amount of disturbance or other issues before that moth might disappear. But if you notice that it looks like the vast majority of these populations are of medium to very low resiliency. And so it would not take much to remove the moth from any of those sites. And this big black dot there is a population that I discovered in Arkansas back in the late 1990s. Used to be hundreds and hundreds of individuals there. 2011, disappeared, it's gone, not a trace. And there's still thousands and thousands and thousands of eryngium plants. I have no idea what happened, other than the fact that the whole region had undergone a series of just brutal droughts that I think probably played a big part in eliminating that bug from that site. There used to be a population known from southeast Nebraska, North Carolina. That population disappeared. I don't know, like they found that in the late 90s, and it was gone a couple years later. They think fire management probably eliminated that one, although I'm not 100% sure on that. This map is from a study I did back in 2016 to 2018, looking for this particular moth throughout the Southeast. And so that's all the herbarium records that I had for Rhingium yucifolium in the red, and then Rhingium aquaticum, which we thought might be a potential food plant as well, in the blue, although the moth has never actually been recorded from what we call Rhingium aquaticum these days. They used to call yucifolium aquaticum back in the day, so that got confusing after a while. But anyway, there were lots of populations. I don't know, 1,500 some odd populations of Rhingium in the Southeast. We selected 200 of them that we thought probably still had the plant, or were known to still have the plant, probably still were known or had large populations of the plant. So we looked at 200 sites ranging from Arkansas to north half of Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi, and we found no sign of the moth whatsoever. Some beautiful sites, fantastic sites, tens of thousands of Rhingium plants, but no sign of the moth whatsoever. And there's been no other butterfly or moth collectors that have, turned that guy up down there. So I get a feeling, I think it's just too hot, to tell you the truth. I think the growing season's too long and it's too hot, and that's probably why they don't occur down there anymore. So yeah, you had a variety of factors that have been stressing this bug for a while. The inherent factors, like I discussed, for the frosted elephant, habitat loss, climate change, fire regime, insecticide, wildlife collection and trade. There's a huge market for rare and endangered bugs, just like everything else. So that's a potentiality. That's why I don't tend to give out the known sites for these particular bugs and a lot of other ones, just because there's collectors that come and look for them. Disease, predation, parasitism, and then competition with herbivores. Like I said, cows love to eat Rhingium. I think deer like to eat Rhingium to some degree as well. And so I thought I would give you guys a few recommendations. I'll start out with some general recommendations, and then I'll talk about fire here in just a minute. And then after that, we can go to questions. So some general recommendations, as you might expect: protect as much habitat as you can. And for bugs, marginal degraded habitat, if it's got a decent representation of native plants, especially, wildflowers, nectar sources and things, those are really valuable insect habitat. Focus your efforts on connecting isolated remnants, and especially in barrens, when you have these isolated openings set in a matrix of close canopy forest. Any efforts to open up corridors between those particular isolated openings would be great, especially for moving these insects, being able to move back and forth between these little areas, especially if you're using fire management or other management techniques to try to improve the habitat for the organisms that live there. Roadsides, railroads, energy transmission right-of-ways can contain really fantastic habitat for grassland insects. Where I lived in Northwest Indiana, pretty much the only prairie that was left was these little scraps along the railroads by my house, and those held fantastic diversity of grassland insects. So these should be protected whenever possible. And roadsides, especially, they connect, so many different natural areas and stuff that they could be really, really good dispersal corridors if managed properly. And so to this end, working with local, state, regional power transportation authorities is essential to successful protection of these natural areas. And so my recommendations shouldn't seem too out of line to you. Minimal spraying of herbicide along right-of-ways whenever possible, especially when you're near a nice natural area. Try to limit mowing. There's so much growing season mowing that seems just so unnecessary that goes on. If they can limit mowing to the dormant season, you're mostly trying to get rid of trees and shrubs. You can come through, cut them down then. You're going to avoid, annihilating nectar sources and food sources for a great variety of organisms if you can hold off until the dormant season to get rid of that stuff. Encourage, recommend, incentivize the use of native plants whenever possible, in these plantings, reclamation, restoration, whatever. And again, on the converse, try to get them to stop using things like autumn olive and crown vetch and Korean bush clover, which I'm sure will be a lot easier said than done. And to this end, there's this fantastic project right now that I don't know how many of you know about called the Monarch Joint Venture. So the monarch butterfly, as you may know, has undergone some massive population declines in North America. And so people are really worried about that, and they've been clamoring to have it listed as endangered species. Well, this bug is widespread enough and occurs in enough habitats that scares a lot of people a lot, that they're going to be required to do things to protect this butterfly. So somebody came up with the ingenious idea that, if we selected a corridor in the central U.S. and started doing some, targeted planting and restoration along that to put in nectar sources and milkweed for the caterpillars and so on and so forth, we might be able to create this fantastic, byway for these butterflies to move back and forth. And so I encourage you to go visit their website, and you can figure out who the players are in this group, and they can give you ideas on how methods they've used to try to work with various authorities, because a lot of people you'd start to talk to them about saving bugs. Like, I don't save bugs, that's not my thing. So finding ways to get them interested in making that their thing is always part of the fun. So I recommend you go and check this out. It's a pretty cool thing. My wife and I drove down the Minnesota part of it a couple of years ago, and it's looking pretty cool. And then the state of Iowa has been doing some fantastic things. The entire I-80 corridor across the state has been planted with prairie vegetation. And that was, I think, Senator Chuck Grassley. He's been a big proponent of that. And then I think the last time I was out there, they were going up 20, I think it's 23 that goes up the west side here. And you have all these fantastic native bluff prairies along here as well. So if they're planting this native vegetation, to me, it just seems like they're really improving, increasing habitat for a lot of these organisms. And then hopefully that would allow these to move, between these isolated remnants. So again, this is a pretty cool project. I think that, the things that they've been doing and finding out are going to be applicable for a lot of groups across the U.S. to use for trying to, conserve biodiversity and so on. So recommendations regarding fire management. Hey, whenever possible, survey for rare insects prior to implementing fire. I know this is probably not going to happen in most cases. It's been rare that I've been able to go to a site before it got burned the first time, but whenever possible, that is a handy thing to figure out, because you're probably going to have some fire sensitive insects there. Again, don't burn all of a site at once, especially when you have rare fire sensitive insects. Try to keep, split your habitat among burn units, and try to burn no more than 25 to maybe 35% of the occupied habitat at the very least in a particular growing season. Obviously, most of your sites probably haven't had insect surveys. And so on those, just don't burn all of the grassy, most floristically diverse portion, in a single unit or all at the same time. Again, try to keep it to 25, 35% in one growing season whenever possible. I understand that on small sites, in particular sites, it's just, you're not going to have the money, time, people, whatever to do that. But I'm just making a recommendation that whenever possible, that would be highly advantageous, and especially for fire sensitive insects. Again, once you've divided your burn units, try not to burn adjacent high quality units back to back. So say you've got one big nice grassy opening that you've split into 2 units. Try not to burn those both, one year right after the other, or even do one in the spring and one the following fall. Those things tend to not work out so well. So you need to include usually about 1 growing season, at least, if not 2, between burns to allow these insects, especially these ones that don't have flight capabilities and so on, to move in from these unburned refugia into these newly restored habitats. And then again, if you can, start utilizing late spring, like after the vegetation has started to sprout a bit, when a lot of these organisms have either begun feeding and then pupated, or you just get patchy or burns at that time, and so you'll get more unburned area that these insects can survive in, and then move into these burned areas immediately afterwards. And then whenever possible, if you can, monitor these rare fire sensitive insect populations on the sites that are receiving fire management. So it doesn't necessarily have to be every year, but if you've got a rare butterfly, if you can get somebody to come in there and take a look after you've done your fire, a year or two later to see how they're doing, that is really handy because, as I said before, insects are the #1 group that's going to benefit from our restoration efforts. They're the most abundant organisms out there. They whether you know it or not, they provide a lot of fantastic services. A lot of people are interested in them more and more every year. I'm just amazed at the number of people that are taking photographs and getting interested in identifying insects. So it would be really good to start incorporating this sort of knowledge on insects into management recommendations. So some conclusions. Kentucky has an amazing diversity of native grassland remnants, and these appear to also harbor a really fantastic insect fauna. A significant subset of those insects appear to be of state, regional, or national conservation concern. They're fire sensitive, but only a small subset of Kentucky's grasslands have been really settled for insects to date. I mean, there's been collecting for mostly butterflies and moths at a few other sites, but a lot of them just haven't had any sort of, real in-depth look at the insect fauna. So anything that can be done to increase that would be fantastic. So additional surveys are warranted and recommended as always. And that includes revisiting sites that, I saw in the 90s. Many of those I haven't been back to since. So it'd be really cool to see what's going on there now. And then, as I just mentioned a while ago, continued conservation and restoration work, incorporating knowledge of grassland insect ecology will greatly benefit Kentucky's insects and their grasslands that they inhabit. And so acknowledgements. A lot of people have helped me out on this. Barry Dalton gave me my first funding, my first shot at doing work on Kentucky grasslands. So that was fantastic. A lot of people from Kentucky State Nature Preserves have been helpful over the years, and I really appreciate it. I had to plug the Indiana Nature Preserves people because they've been really helpful as well. And the Forest Service at the Hoosier National Forest has been great. Terry and David from Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. I don't know if David's even there anymore, but I worked with David years ago up in Meade County there when Lapland Barrens was going to be a wildlife management area back in the day. So I want to thank Greg for helping me get this thing organized and figuring out, how a Luddite goes about operating a computer properly. So I really appreciate that. Dr. Charles Colville used to teach at University of Louisville. Lauren Gibson and Richard Henderson with the Kentucky Lepidopterist Society have been just fantastic in supplying me with all sorts of information on Kentucky butterflies and moths over the years. And then last but not least, I really would like to thank all the photographers for allowing me to use their photos today. That was it's always great to show people what you're talking about. And I should have plugged them in here, but my son and my wife, I also want to thank very much for putting up with my nonsense over the years and being extremely helpful in my studies of bugs. And I think with that, I am done. And if you have any questions, I will try to answer those to the best of my ability.
Great. Thanks, Jim. That was really good. Appreciate it.
No problem.
And if people have questions, you can raise your hand. And I saw a couple in the chat we can get to also. But Christina, go ahead. And if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask your question.
Hi, I was just wondering, when you were running through some of those species-specific slides and talking about the different groups and the fire-sensitive species within those different groups of insects, do you have a recommendation on a list, sort of a comprehensive list of those species? Because not all of the species you mentioned would maybe be on our sensitive or conservation species list. So
right.
It would be, I didn't know, maybe I missed it. Maybe you also said that in the slide somewhere, but if you had a recommendation of if there is some sort of comprehensive list of fire sensitive insects, that'd just be helpful for some of us on the management side.
Sure. Yeah, there's oh man. Ron Panzer in Illinois has been doing a lot of work, but his stuff is all on tallgrass prairie up around Chicago, and he's put out huge list, but a fair number of those species don't occur in Kentucky. And it's going to vary from site to site. I mean, I had the list from like my old studies and stuff like that. I could come up with a list of species that I've found, but as I said, you know, I've only looked at a tiny fraction of grassland remnants in Kentucky. So a lot of your sites probably have species that I don't even know about.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, if you did have a list, or if there was one available that was more local, I think that any list would be better than nothing, because I mean, unfortunately, the reality is that, I mean, I don't know, I have 178,000 acres and just me and my program. So some of the monitoring stuff is, you know, so it's so far out of reach that our best hope is to at least just have kind of an idea of some of these species and be thinking about it. But a list like that of just some that, you know, right off the top, they may not be on our sensitive species list yet. So it would be kind of nice if there was like a Kentucky list of fire sensitive species that we could be thinking about. Because I was just thinking about this as you were, you know, running through the talk. It's all great information, but we have the pretty big open lands management program on the Cumberland district on the Daniel Boone, which we can't keep that habitat open without fire.
Sure. No. I wasn't meaning that, yeah, you shouldn't use fire in any way. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, that would be just a helpful, you know, because I definitely want to consider those species and those needs, but sometimes trying to even get that information can be tricky, because like you said, there's so many of them.
Right.
There's so many different species. So it was a really helpful talk, but that would be something, you know, it'd be nice if there was kind of like a Kentucky list.
Okay. I think Kentucky, yeah, you guys are working, well, at least some of you are working with Tennessee on getting a grant to do restoration work in the Cumberland Plateau. And I gave them a big Excel table of, you know, it was mostly butterflies and moths. I don't think I even did much with other groups, but the ones that are rare in the region, just kind of like I did for my talk here. I've got that all down on an Excel table that I can give you guys that you can take a look at. Yeah.
Thank
and then
you.
I could even, yeah, maybe, we'll see how much time I got. I've got 2 reports I got to get done by the end of the year. So I was wondering if I could, I've in some other insects to let you know. But, and that's why I kind of gave the recommendation of, you know, try to burn no more than 25 or 35% of your most floristically diverse areas. And I'm thinking more of sites that, you know, where you've got, you know, a small isolated, you know, floristically diverse openings surrounded by mostly forest, to try not to just burn that, you know, most floristically diverse part by itself all at once. And I realize that on some sites, hey, that's all you can do. We've got limited time and people, money, wanted to get some restoration done, and that's what we did. So and then we just hope for the best. And that kind of ties in also with the thing with roads and rights of ways and so on. If we can start getting those people to start managing those sites a little bit better, that you know, that habitat would also be available, so that you could have populations on nearby roadsides or rights of way that could be used to, you know, hopefully you know, repopulate you know, recently restored habitat. That made sense.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
No problem. Yes, and I'll get that Excel table if I can send it to Greg today.
Okay, that'd be great. Yeah, I mean, so not to rush you or to put more work on your plate, but
no, I got that one made up. Like I said, add and leaf hoppers, but with the butterflies and stuff, I mean, if you're just targeting them and thinking about them, management that you do for them should benefit, you know, the other ones as well. So
Great. Anybody else? Jim, I saw in the chat there were a couple questions about citations. If you had a citation for the ethanol mandate back in the 2000s when there was that going on, if you had a citation for that, and if the frosted elephant study was published and available somewhere, people could look up.
Which frosted elephant, the one that I did, or
yeah, in Harlan County.
Oh, yeah, I gave Nature Preserves a little write up on that. Yeah.
Okay.
And I can ask them if it's okay if I share that.
Okay. Jim, can you talk a little bit more about the status of Shininia jaguaria?
Jaguarina, yeah.
Jaguarina, yeah, I was gonna say I probably butchered that.
The jaguar flower moth, yeah. Yeah, what would you like to know? I don't know. I'm trying to find out. I think I got the names on the guys that are supposed to be doing the write-up, but as to when and where it's going to be published, I don't know. I tried to find that out earlier this year and got nowhere on that, so I'm still poking around. But if I find out, I can surely let you know. Yeah, and those are easy to find. If anybody that's interested in looking for those, what is it? Orbexulum pedunculatum, Samson snakeweed, snake root, something like that. It occurs on that. The moths are out from early to late June, but the caterpillars are usually out in July. Yeah, you can start finding them late June but from like the 1st to mid-July, you can find them. And usually they're sitting right out on the vegetation. That photo I included was one that was sitting on a grass stem right next to an Orbexulum plant. But usually they're sitting right on the scurfy peas.
Okay.
And that has not been turned up in Kentucky yet. So anybody that finds that in Kentucky, that'll be nice news.
Nice. Go ahead, Cody.
Yeah, thanks, Craig, and thanks, Jim. This is some really cool information. I guess I kind of had maybe a comment from Christy's really good idea to develop kind of this list of species. I was thinking also if you could give some guidance on maybe some good indicator species of vegetation. So when, as fire practitioners, when we go on a landscape, we might not have any idea what kind of insects are out there.
Sure.
But a lot of times we might have a good idea of kind of some of the more rare vegetative communities. And if you could speak about or add to that list some rare plants that might give us a good indication of what kind of insects might be out there.
All right. The thing, a fair number of these are feeding on pretty common prairie stuff. Like I said, that Flexenia reflexa feeds on Indian grass, but that the bug does not occur everywhere Indian grass occurs. And even when it does, it tends to be pretty low numbers, which is odd because I have a few sites in Kentucky where that thing's really common, but in general, that bug's not common on the landscape. So I usually just go on a more general, if it's the stuff that you look at, oh, that's a really nice floristically diverse particular opening or grassland area or woodland or whatever, if that's the only one you've got, set in this matrix of closed canopy forest, that then that's when I would just say, yeah, try to divide that into at least 2 units, which you would be burning, maybe 50% of it, but still 50% of it's going unburned. Ron Panzer, who's done a lot of papers, and I can send you a list of his papers. He's done a lot of pretty in-depth research up in Illinois looking at fire effects and how long it takes these populations to rebound from burns and stuff. So I can send you his references that you guys can take a look at if you're interested in that. I mean, I've got a bunch of, I could send you a whole bunch of references if you're interested. So yeah, that's just, if it looks floristically diverse, it's got a lot of little blue stem and stuff like that, it's probably going to have, good diversity of bugs. And same goes for, big blue Indian grass. Heck, even poverty oatgrass, Danthonia, is food for a lot of stuff. So just anywhere where you got a really good, diverse herbaceous vegetation going, you're probably going to have a really good diverse insect population as well, or fauna.
Cool, thank you.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. I'd definitely be interested in, maybe having some of those vegetation species on that list. And then also, if you wouldn't mind sharing those citation lists, that'd be awesome too.
Sure.
Good. Thank you.
Back to Jacarina.
Yeah.
The new species that has not been
Nope.
that's not been in Kentucky.
No, that's one. That's one I'm
right?
waiting.
That's okay. Right.
I'm
Okay.
waiting to get
Yep.
a name on that thing. Yeah.
And do you know the population of scurf pea moth in Kentucky?
There isn't any. None yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, you've got a couple. I know of a couple of sites that have got large populations of that plant, so that the moth is probably there. Just nobody's looked for it yet. I think Shelby Fulton, maybe she may have looked a little bit. I can't remember. Yeah, from talking to her, if she looked for that thing yet or not.
Okay. And let's see. I got a question. So if data or results on different firing techniques for burns on NWSG, then that would be helpful with a species sensitive list. Do slow black burns or anyone experiencing burning when RH are higher? That'd be interesting to know.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And I know that burning at those times can often be loads of labs trying to control shrubs and stuff, because one of the sites I work on in southern Indiana, their last burn they did there was it must have been I think it was later in the season and probably higher humidity, and yeah, they got very little kill on shrubs. It really left a lot of them. I was amazed when I went back there this last year. So I know how that can work. And anytime you can do a combination of clearing first and then cutting, I've always had real good luck with that. I worked on I forgot to mention, but yeah, I worked on an intensive habitat restoration project for the Carner Blue in Indiana on a steel mill of all things back in, this was the early mid 90s. And yeah, the first thing we came in and did was, well, we had a lot of money, so that wasn't a limiting factor at the time. So but we thinned trees heavily and then came back and did fire later on. And I was amazed right after we thinned the trees how much the vegetation came back. So we came back and did vegetation monitoring 1 year before we got in and did fire. So I know that but I know that like in the Forest Service in southern Indiana, they had issues with the person that was doing their mowing wasn't cleaning the mower deck off between going to sites. And so he started moving, Japanese stillgrass around and stuff like that. So I know everybody has to be careful about that kind of stuff, but I think brush hogging is one that could be used in combination whenever possible. I mean, I understand, certain sites are inaccessible and so on, but yeah, if you can, that combination often works really well.
Well, don't forget that slow backing burns will consume the fuel more completely. So,
Right.
You're going to hurt the overwintering litter dwellers that way too. So sometimes a head fire that moves across really
Right.
fast and
Real
leaves some
fast, yeah.
patchiness is better. And this is Joyce Bender. I work.
Hi, Joyce.
It's good to see or hear you, Jim. I worked on maintaining the rattlesnake master borer moth for most of my career, and
I know.
We have kept that bug on the ground out there because of the way we divided up the units and did different firing techniques. So you can be successful if you're just mindful that if you don't know you have a bug, just act like you do and be conservative in your burning, your ignition, and the size of your units. If you've got small glade areas, then it's hard to think about dividing that in half. But these
right,
bugs,
no. And there, I think if you could divide your glade openings, don't burn all of them.
We did, and it worked. So these bugs don't move. You have to be thinking about that.
I agree.
All right. Any other last questions before we kind of wrap things up? All right. Well, go ahead, John.
So I have a question about the rattlesnake master borer moth.
Mm-hmm.
We have what I would consider, from what you describe, as pretty decent habitat for that. Would there be any, identifying characteristics that you could notice on plants this time of year if we were to go out and look to see if maybe there's actually,
this time of year, I would think you'd have fairly difficult. I mean, you could possibly, I mean, if you found one that had larvae in it, the frass would still be there, but it's a lot easier, you know, early spring, right when they start putting out flower stalks. That's the best, because like I said, the plants that have a larva boring into it, I don't think I've ever seen one put up a flower stalk. They usually, they take out that central root part of the root crown, and they just don't produce a flowering stem that year. So you just go around and look for the basal rosettes, and then ones that have the larvae in them will have this large pile of brownish looking, you know, it's almost like crumbly soil, but it's poop that they've just been shoving back out of their tunnel. And that's the best time of year to look for them. The moths are hard to catch. They don't always come to light. And the weather, they're out in, you know, October. So the weather that time of year isn't that great. So they're often difficult to find. That. So you usually almost always have to look for the caterpillars to know whether or not they're there. But I would say late springish, early summer down your way. And Kentucky, Ellis Loudermilk looked at all the known Eryngium populations in the state back in, 2016 maybe, for the moth, and he didn't find any new populations.
Okay.
We did find one, Jim, at a preserve nearby.
Yeah, Shelby mentioned that.
Yeah, there's the two places, but
yeah, right north of the main population.
June's a good time to go out and look for the aborted stems.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks again, Jim, for giving this presentation. It was really great and informative. Hopefully, this will be very useful for land managers here in Kentucky. So thanks.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having me.